Welcome attendees and to our presenters. My name is Adam Davey. I'm the CEO of the Winston Churchill Trust. We're based in Canberra, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I'm going to begin this information session with an overview of what Churchill Fellowships are about, how you apply, and the sorts of things that we're looking for. I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nations people, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are tuning into this webinar, and to let you know that we have quite a strong First Nations Churchill Fellows network. In fact, we have a meeting tomorrow afternoon, and I mention that specifically because I'd like to encourage you to apply and also to get involved with that network if you want to. A little bit of housekeeping. You'll all be able to submit questions via the Q&A function. If you missed your chance to think of questions during this session, you can contact the Trust directly, either via email through our website, or you can phone the office, and our number is on the website as well. We'll also be holding future information sessions over the coming weeks, and you're welcome to attend another session if you want to. And just finally, I'd like to acknowledge the very difficult times we're living through with the COVID pandemic. It's been very disruptive, with lots of uncertainty and suffering. And I hope that you're attending this session with a positive outlook and a hopeful outlook for the future. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So I'm often asked, where does the money come from for Churchill Fellowships? And that's a very good question. When Winston Churchill resigned as British Prime Minister in 1955, he was 80 years of age. He'd served under 5 reigning monarchs, survived 3 wars. He'd been a writer, an historian, a journalist, a painter, and he'd even won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. There was a widespread desire to honour Sir Winston Churchill and capture the essence of his public service, his intellect, and even his humour for many generations to come. Now, he wasn't perfect, and you can read some insightful essays on our website that we've commissioned that explore Sir Winston Churchill through a contemporary lens. But he was someone who readily believed anything was possible if you put your mind to it. And he was a man who readily believed, that he was one of the greatest figures in history were those who made a contribution to public service and their fellow countrymen. Now, when the Prime Minister at the time, Sir Robert Menzies, announced the news of Sir Winston's death to Australians in January 1965, he simultaneously announced a national fundraising event to establish the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust and the creation of Churchill Fellowships. So on Churchill Memorial Sunday, 28th of January 1965, a national door-to-door appeal was undertaken, and over 220,000 Australians, with a lot of support from the Returned Services League, went around collecting money from generous Australians. And with government and business contributions combined, about £2.2 million was raised. That's about $4 million. So that money has been carefully invested, and there's been, we get bequests and donations as well that helps improve those funds. But suffice to say, we are a perpetual trust, and we look after over $100 million of funds, and we use the interest to pay for Churchill Fellowships, which is why we can award over 100 Churchill Fellowships each year at a cost of well in excess of $3 million. So that's where the money comes from for the Churchill Fellows, a bit of the history. You can read more about that on our website. I'm also often asked, what are the attributes of a Churchill Fellow? And you can see on the slide there that Churchill Fellows are the types of people who are passionate and committed to an issue, and they want to learn and share their knowledge so that others in their communities might benefit. Now, it could quite possibly be you. We invest in people and we invest in ideas. Now, a bit about Churchill Fellowships. They're a unique and prestigious opportunity available to people from all walks of life. Indeed, a Churchill Fellowship is known to open doors to organisations overseas that you might not otherwise get the opportunity to meet and interact with. Importantly, it's not an academic scholarship, so you don't have to have any specific qualifications. You don't have to even finish year 10. That's not important to us. And it's not a funding grant. So there's a lot of freedom and trust in Churchill Fellows to just get out there and do their projects without our interference and to come back and share that knowledge. It's not just an overseas trip, mind you. It's the start of a lifelong journey and your contribution to make Australia better. A Churchill Fellowship does not need to comprise formal research. So you can learn new skills, build networks, observe best practice in your chosen field. The fellowship is for overseas travel only and must be between 4 to 8 weeks in duration and taken as one complete journey. We do have some new things that we're offering, which I'll come to shortly. We've awarded nearly 4,500 fellowships since 1965, and each year there are typically more than 100 awarded. Churchill Fellows travel around the world on the widest range and depth of topics and bring back to this country information, networks, projects, products, ideas, innovations that make this country even stronger. So personal eligibility means you must be an Australian citizen, or as of this year, a permanent resident is also eligible. And you have to be over the age of 18 on the application closing date. The ability to travel overseas is essential, and we can provide support for you if you have a disability. For example, you might need to take a carer with you. But the ability to travel overseas is critical. So I've had some questions from people asking if they have to be vaccinated to apply for COVID, to apply for a fellowship. And really that doesn't matter in terms of applying for the fellowship, but it might matter at the time when you have to travel. So keep that in mind if that's you. We now also offer virtual research options for people who cannot travel, perhaps due to a disability or a caring responsibility. So that means we would accept research done using technology like you're using today to meet with people where physically it's not possible or extremely difficult for you to travel overseas. And if that's you, I'd encourage you to get in touch with us here at the Trust to discuss so we can be aware of that option. And also a new thing is for people living in remote parts of Australia, we'll be offering domestic travel opportunities. So we have introduced that based on feedback we've received over the last few years, that for some people, the opportunity to travel within Australia when they're living in a remote part of Australia is a significant challenge in itself. And the benefits of domestic travel and bringing that knowledge back to their community may also be very high, and the option to travel overseas just may not be possible. So again, if that's you, please contact the Trust to discuss that further. Now, Churchill Fellowship is an individual project. It's not a team project. So you can't apply as part of a project team. There can only be one Churchill Fellow. So please keep that in mind. It is possible to take someone with you if that's appropriate, and you can fund that to help you with your research, but you will be the Churchill Fellow. If you're undertaking tertiary studies, that's okay. However, your proposed project for your Churchill Fellowship cannot directly form part of that study that you're undertaking. The reason for that is we expect you to be 100% committed to your Churchill Fellowship, including your preparation of a report and sharing that knowledge and implementing your recommendations on your return. So if you're undertaking a PhD or some other form of study, and this is just seen in your mind as part of it, that won't give you 100% focus on the fellowship, and that's why we say that. So importantly, though, I do need you to hear me say that a Churchill Fellowship is an opportunity for people from all walks of life. And that's a phrase that gets thrown around quite a lot, but for us, it's actually our mantra. In terms of the projects, we do have some requirements. There must be some benefit to the Australian community. So by you bringing back the knowledge and sharing it, or sharing ideas or practices or your skills, you need to demonstrate to us that that can be a benefit to your community. You also must demonstrate that you fully explored your topic or issue within Australia to be considered. I think that's fairly obvious why we don't want to send people overseas to learn things they could have learnt from someone else within Australia who's already doing those things. So the purpose of a Churchill Fellowship is that, you know, you've seen things happening overseas, you know they're not happening in Australia, you want to go over there, learn more about it, think about how it could be applied here in Australia. The project must be self-contained. So as I mentioned, it can't be part of your university degree or project, but it also can't be partly funded by another organisation. So we're not, you know, a travel budget or a travel bucket for your organisation to tap into. The Churchill Fellowship is a standalone project. Your project for your Churchill Fellowship doesn't need to relate to your employment directly, but it can, and it often does, I think, for good reason. And what we're looking for, particularly in the horticulture sector, are people who are working in the horticulture industry, perhaps working for, you know, a levy-paying organisation. We don't set the topics or the limits, though. That's our strength. This session is about horticulture, but you may be tuning in and have an interest in something entirely different, and that's perfectly fine. So you do design your own project, and that's the beauty of a Churchill Fellowship. You design your project. We don't tell you how to do it. If you can think of a suitable topic, then there's no limits. Your job is to convince us why your project is important and why you're the right person to do it. We do have some what we call sponsored Churchill Fellowships, where generous individuals or organisations we're partnering with have agreed to fund fellowships on specific topics. So whilst for a Churchill Fellowship, you know, topics are broad and open, we do have some opportunities within that to be awarded a fellowship on a particular topic or field. For example, for this session, a couple of relevant ones include a partnership we have with Horticulture. So they're specifically working with us, looking for people to cultivate new ideas in horticulture. So we're looking for people who work in the industry, particularly, and many of you may be involved with a levy-paying part of the industry or an employer, and we're looking for you to apply, particularly for a Churchill Fellowship in relation to horticulture. And a new Churchill Fellowship this year is the Saskia Beer Churchill Fellowship. So Colin and Maggie Beer have supported this fellowship, which is looking for innovation in food production or farming. So that fellowship really is focusing on supporting passionate food lovers, be they cooks or chefs or farmers or growers, producers or entrepreneurs. So that's a wonderful opportunity. And if you go to our website, you'll be able to look into those two sponsored fellowships as well as many more that we have on the website. But it's important, I think, to know that when you're applying for a fellowship, you'll get the opportunity to select one or two sponsored fellowships. You don't have to select any. It makes no difference in terms of the assessment of you for a Churchill Fellowship. It just helps us spot early particular people and projects that we can align with those sponsored fellowships. So you won't be advantaged or disadvantaged by doing that, but certainly it does help us look for the best candidates for those sponsored fellowships. So you do apply online. Applications close on the 28th of April. It's an online form. You can save and exit it and go back to it multiple times. It's quite easy to use. If you have a problem using the online form, however, please talk to us, particularly if you have a disability and that's a barrier for you. We don't want anyone to be turned away because they can't fill out a form. Now, remember, you're competing against all the other applicants, and it's a competitive process. So think about how you're going to convince the selectors to invest in you and your project or your idea. You'll need two references, someone who can vouch for your personal characteristics and someone who is an authority or recognised in your particular subject matter, topic or field that you're proposing to undertake your fellowship on. Early advice there is to contact those referees as soon as you can to make sure that they're going to be available and around in time to submit their references for your application. That's all done through the application form. It's all done electronically, so it's quite straightforward. But it's not as straightforward if you leave it to the last minute and they're not available. That's when you'll find yourself unable to submit your application. Now, Churchill Fellows have told the Trust time again that the process of completing the application and working through it is really valuable in helping distill what you want to do and what you want to achieve. So I would say again, get in early, create an application, read through the form, start putting information there, think about how you want to refine your particular project, what you want to achieve with it. Don't leave it to the last minute, because it certainly won't be your best application. And we do get questions about the itinerary. And so limit your itinerary to the destinations that will be of most benefit for your project. Don't overcrowd your itinerary. So you'll be asked in the application form to list which country you want to go to, the city, the person or the organisation that you want to meet with, and the duration. So in half-week chunks, how long you want to be there for that meeting. Now, we do encourage you to allow time to arrive, time to explore the country you're in and to understand culturally how everything works and to really get a good understanding. Time for meetings that you don't know you're going to get until you get there. And then someone says, hey, you should go and meet with so-and-so. You don't want to be saying, oh, I've got to get on a plane tomorrow. You want to have a little bit of fat built in to your itinerary to allow you to fully experience and immerse yourself in what you're doing. So that's, I think, pretty important advice for you. And you don't have to have contacted the people or the organisations to confirm that they'll meet with you, because you haven't got the fellowship yet. So we need you to have a good sense of who you want to meet with and why, and I guess have a good understanding that they would be willing to meet with people, but you don't need to have made that contact to put your application in. Now, I mentioned COVID at the start. It's been, I guess, fairly spectacular in terms of stopping Churchill Fellows from travelling physically overseas. I'm really pleased to say that this week we'll see a Churchill Fellow depart Australia for the first time in a couple of years. So I'm pretty excited by that. The world is starting to open up. It's still a bit uncertain though, and travel, is not as the same as it was in 2019. If you're successful this year in your Churchill Fellowship application, you won't be travelling until the beginning of 2023. So I'm very hopeful that by that point, things will be a lot clearer and a lot smoother. So fingers crossed that that's going to be the case. We do provide insurance, travel insurance, and all those sorts of things that you'd expect. Your safety is our number one priority. So we don't let you travel to countries that Smart Traveller advise against travelling to. So keep that in mind when you're putting your itinerary together as well. And of course, things can change. So there is some flexibility between when you put your application in, when you interviewed, and when you travel. There may be some need to make some alterations, some minor changes to your itinerary, and we can accommodate that in most cases. So on the selection process, I think it's important to know that the Trust has panels and committees in each state and territory comprising people from across a range of fields and sectors. And applications are shortlisted, referees are taken into account, and then we have interviews which help determine who will receive a fellowship. If you look on our website, you'll see that the dates for interviews are already available and listed. About half of those people interviewed are likely to receive a Churchill Fellowship. So getting an interview is actually quite a significant thing. And some people get a Churchill Fellowship on their first attempt. Other people might take 2 or 3 times. So please, just have a go. Don't be put off by the fact it is a competitive process. You might surprise yourself. The odds are pretty good if you can get to an interview. So our recommendations from all those selection committees and panels then go to our board, and in September, final decisions will be made. So we're often asked for tips in relation to the application process, and the best tips I can give you are to read and address the selection criteria and use as little jargon as possible. So we do have representatives from different sectors and industries on our selection panels, but don't assume that everyone reading your application has a deep understanding of your topic and your issues. So try to use plain English, be succinct, and be clear. So just finally, remember, it is a competitive process. Churchill Fellowships are prestigious, they're well funded, and they're highly contested. But that's not a reason to be shy. It's a reason to put the most effort into your application and to start early. You'll be competing with everyone else on the same terms, and I guess, around this webinar today. You know, we've got a lot of people that hopefully will be encouraged to apply. The team here in Canberra are available on this number, and you can go to our website as well, where we've got questions and answers, frequently asked questions, and lots of information. At the end of this session, and the two Churchill Fellows about to speak will then answer any questions that you put up in the chat today as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker today, Churchill Fellow from Tasmania, Sallyann Dakis. Sally was awarded her Churchill Fellowship in 2005 to study the value adding and marketing of both niche and bulk cherry products for food processing industry, and to explore their potential for Australia. And Sally's a rural journalist. She has been for many years. She operates a cherry and flower farm in the Coal River Valley. Sally also has sat on our selection committee, so she knows not only what it takes to get a Churchill Fellowship, but she knows what it takes to select one. So she's a great speaker to have here today. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Sally.
Thank you very much, Adam, and welcome everybody to this briefing on how to go about applying for a Churchill Fellowship. I'll just give you a little bit of an introduction to my subject area and where I travelled to first of all. As Adam mentioned, it was all about cherries, and as a cherry grower, I'd observed the rapid rate of growth of Tasmania's cherry industry. And in fact, it's still growing, and as a grower myself, and anybody involved in the fruit or vegetable industry would realise that there is always a section of the crop that's harvested that isn't up to scratch, what we call seconds. And it was really an opportunity in my study to look at what we could do with seconds cherries. So I chose to visit a country where there is a great culture of cherries, and that is America. You can see on the screen some cherry canned cherries, and this is for, of course, the cherry pies, very traditional for America. I also visited Provence in France, which is a smaller scale cherry region, and I went to Kent in the UK. Cherry growing in the UK had pretty much almost been wiped out as a result of competition as a part of the European Union from cheaper and larger volumes of cherries from mostly Eastern Europe, but it was undergoing a revival and still is. I visited not just farms and farmers, but also fruit cooperatives, food processors, some people doing some interesting research on cherries, and also visited some cherry conferences, looking at all aspects of cherries. So I'll just see if I can, yes, head over to the next screen. So we were asked to take a look at what some of the highlights were from our Churchill Fellowship. The first thing that surprised me was don't go overseas, you know, with anything of a cultural cringe, because what can be really reassuring is the fact that our industries are right up there. And it was very encouraging to know just how professional Australia's fruit industry is, our standards, you know, in terms of food safety, food processing, the investment that goes into research. What you've got here is some photographs. This is my husband, Chris, showing one of the largest cherry growers in Kent, how he goes about pruning and training his cherry trees. So it's all about production as well. We've got a picture of a young man who's weighing out cherries in a very family, almost a cottage style industry, a cherry industry in France. And then this rather antiquated but interesting cherry picking system, which is so an anathema to what we do in Australia, because all of our tree training systems are designed for pedestrian picking, just for sheer labour efficiency. So that was the first highlight, really, was the fact that Australia can hold its head up really high in terms of what we do. The other thing is that when you think about your Churchill Fellowship, you tend to think if you're going overseas to harvest lots of knowledge. Really, it is actually a two-way exchange. And in order to open doors and to meet people, it's good to take stuff there, your own experience, you know, your own knowledge, because that's the way the world works. It's about networks. And if you can provide some guidance as to what you do that can help them, then it's going to make a whole lot of difference. This was one of the other highlights. What you can see here is a cherry festival in Provence. And it was very, very traditional, a lot of historical costumes, a lot of pomp, a lot of pageantry. They have an appellation scheme for cherries, which was very interesting, a little bit like the legal appellation for wine. You know, you can't call a sparkling wine in Australia champagne, you can't make camembert. And so too for cherries if in this part of Provence. And it was because my Churchill Fellowship was also looking at branding. And I thought this is an interesting branding option. And I assumed that it was very, very traditional. And I was really surprised to discover that this appellation scheme had started in the 1970s. So there's always room for innovation, even in what you might think is a very, very traditional field. And I think there's a lot of upsides for more regional branding of food and cherries. Another one of the highlights was the emergence of innovation. And essentially that's what you're going to be doing when you look at Churchill knowledge, is that you're going to be speaking to the innovators, people that are pushing the envelope. And so too with cherries, what I saw was very much the traditional cherry products, things like glacé cherries. When was the last time you bought a glacé cherry? Cocktail cherries, cherry pies, which are very much, as I said, part of the American culture, but not so in Australia. And the cherry jams, very much traditional, but the emergence of a whole lot of new products, which give us a lot of scope here in Tasmania and Australia, really harvesting the high value anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, anthocyanins that you get in red fruits like cherries. A lot of research going into how cherries are really good for recovery for elite athletes. The anti-inflammatory, antioxidant capacity helps muscle recovery. The snack food market, a huge area. Cherry juice concentrate, again, with all those health-giving products, moving into the nutraceutical markets and the food manufacturing market. So I guess that is a lot of opportunity. And one of the things that I recommended as a part of my Churchill Fellowship was to invest in research here in Australia on our own cherries so that we can back up the sort of claims that, really help promote healthy food products. And that's exactly what's happened by some innovative Tasmanian companies. So the other thing I thought I might just mention briefly is preparing for your application. So this might be once you've actually received the approval that you've become a Churchill Fellow. I think in retrospect, I looked at doing it all on my own rather than using the network. And I think if I were to do it again, or my advice to you is, you don't have to be the sum of the knowledge of all the best people to meet or the places to go. And I think I'd really put my feelers out now as, because the world is a network within the industry or the sector that you work in. And so if you ask, if you were going to study X, where would you go? Because then you can really, I was going to say cherry pick, but no, you can really pick the best places to go because you've only got a limited amount of time. So don't be afraid to ask your friends or your colleagues or ring up people and say, if you were going to go, where would you go? Who would you meet? What questions do you want answered? Really hone it down. The other thing is about relationships, because in my field, I was asking people to talk about their product development, their intellectual property, the kind of research that and their, decades of experience. And so you've got to give something to them in order for this to be a positive exchange. Otherwise, you're just going around parasitizing everything. And so I really do think that the ethos of the Churchill Fellowship is you take your knowledge and be prepared to share that as an exchange for what you might get out of your exchange. And Adam would mention, and everyone will tell you, don't jam pack your schedule so that you can't be there for the unexpected, because you will always meet interesting people and they will say, do this or go there. And this is a little snapshot of Provence, which we managed to have a nice few glasses of wine underneath a plane tree as a part of our Churchill Fellowship. So look, honestly, I think that's pretty much my highlights as a part of my Churchill Fellowship. Happy to take questions later on in part of this session, Adam.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Sally. All right. Welcome to Mike Hayes. As a good segue there, Sally talked about having a glass of wine under a plane tree. So Mike is a Churchill Fellow awarded in 2012 from Queensland. And his project was to research alternative grape varieties that would suit Queensland's climate. And I think it's safe to say he's probably achieved that. Michael's passion and love for all things wine is evident in his almost 40 years of experience in the industry, which includes consulting, education, and vineyard design. Mike was a 2017 ASVO Australian Winemaker of the Year. He completed his Churchill Fellowship in 2013, visiting 50 wine regions in Europe looking for alternative varieties to tackle climate change. His research led him to create the Vineyard of the Future project. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin with, just get myself up. I'd like to begin with thanking the Churchill Trust for listening, and also to all the new applicants. I wish you all the best. If you're awarded the Churchill Fellowship, it will surely be one of the greatest experiences that you'll ever take an opportunity in your life. Prior to even my application, I was aware of the Churchill Fellowship when I was about 12 years of age. Angelo Puglisi, another industry colleague of mine, he was awarded in 1976, I think, to travel Europe and to look at fermentation of wine. So I began my search, but I'd like to start it really actually with sharing my screen. And this is where I began. After I was awarded the Churchill Fellowship, I wanted to chase the vintage. So I started in the hottest part of Europe, which is the southern Alentejo region in Portugal. And I ended up right up in the northern parts of Germany. So what I was looking at were varieties that would withstand climatic variability going forward. And not only that, I wanted to see how resilient they were against adverse weather conditions at or around a harvest. So some 500 varieties later, I think we end up about 650 I actually looked at, and travelling through 50 wine regions, it was definitely an experience of a lifetime. What it did for me when I came back is, which I'll explain shortly, but probably the highlights. I think the highlights is that as a 15-year-old kid, you have these dreams of travelling the world. And I think that's what the Churchill Fellowship offers to everybody, is to chase your dreams and do not give up dreaming. And my dreams were to go to a region called Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the south of France, because they had 13 varieties of white and red they could include in a bottle of red wine. So I wanted to chase that and have a look. And I must admit, it was a few times that I became quite emotional on my Churchill Fellowship. And this was one of them, when I reached the town of Châteauneuf-du-Pape in France to have a look at these 13 amazing varieties. And it was an emotional time in my life, because I knew I'd reached one of my dreams and fulfilled one of my dreams. The Churchill Fellowship has an amazing amount of respect globally, and it opened up many doors. Once they realised that who I was and where I was going and what I was trying to achieve, they just opened up doors all throughout the next regions. They actually prepared myself and my tour to be greeted by people, and I thought it was just it was a very convivial time. I've met so many different personalities and again, just beautiful people. So just having a look at some of the regions I did travel through, and like what I said, it was 14 countries, it was 50 wine regions. And particularly, probably some of the most favourite were the Italians. I always remark on the Italians because their generosity and warmthness, and I've made friends for life there, and they've actually visited me over here since I returned from my Churchill Fellowship. And look, everybody was great. Everybody, I think this is a beautiful part of the world, is that if you're a Churchill Fellow, you've obviously got there because you have a desire or a will to achieve in life. And that's passed on through your personality. And they pick this up. They pick it up quite well. Or I can give you a bit of advice when you're preparing your Churchill Fellowship. Be very precise, have it mapped out in your mind what you want to do and why you want to do it, and how that is going to be fed to either your community or to family, could be, or to the industry that you're involved in. And my objection was to come back with a plethora of varieties to put into not only Queensland but Australia. Is as the climate changes or the variability of the climate continues, we will have these varieties, hence the Vineyard of the Future project. I came across some very interesting facts. Europe were far more advanced in researching the varieties for the climate change than what Australia was. And I think they were probably 10 years in front of us. But great encouragement for me to continue my studies, in which I did, and I still do, by the way, today. To give you some idea, I ended up importing one of these rare varieties. And this one here, there's only 2 vineyards in the world with this Tempranillo Blanco variety, which you're looking at now. And it's a white, what they call a sport, which is like a chimera, a monster of a variety where it's mutated into a white variety from red. And my wife and I end up importing it over to Australia, and we've actually got it growing here now. So we were very fortunate to be able to do that. This was one of the most amazing varieties, which has now been firmly placed into the granite belt and into Queensland. Moscato Giallo, as you can see, my observations of loose bunches and actual trellis, the actual trellis architecture and the bunch architecture were 2 of the key points that I wanted to look at. And this is one of them, as you can see, loose bunches. Also, some very amazing stuff that I was brought up to. Dr. Roberto Miravalle with Barbera, he was showing me how in his 55 years of study, the leaf has actually mutated and is a different shape now from this famous variety from northwest Italy. These people actually were very interested in what I was doing, and particularly when on my return, I wanted to get that group of varieties at the Queensland College of Wine and Tourism and to start a library for the future. And I think this is where, and now I've also written many publications on this, and these are the varieties that I've chosen for cool climates in Australia. And I was particularly looking at the varieties that would handle both cool and wet and hot and humid climates. And there were quite a few. Out of the 650 varieties, I probably ended up with about 120. So there's a few surprises there that people haven't probably heard of. Maturano in Spain, Menthia, another Spain variety. But moving on, and I think the Churchill Fellowship made me grow up as a human being, and from a kid that comes from the youngest of 9 children in a remote part of the granite belt. I had to go over to a country and navigate myself around the country by driving on the wrong side of the road and hopping in the car on completely different. But it made me realise just how special it was to be chosen as a Churchill Fellow. And like, all I can say to you people is good luck in what you're doing, because on my return, and as I was told by a previous Churchill Fellow, you won't believe what doors it will open up. And I have just been possibly the most fortunate human being to be awarded the Australian Society of Viticulture Winemaker of the Year in 2017. And that was the same year that I also was awarded the Professional Alumnus of the Year at the University of Southern Queensland. And I went on to win the award, the Samuel Bassett Award. These were all tied into my Churchill Fellowship, because they could see what I was giving to my industry and continuing my studies. So the Churchill Fellowship was the guide, and it produced the passion for me to follow and continue on today. And I've just been involved in many lectures around Australia. I continually do now that we've opened back up after COVID. I'm continually going around Australia, lecturing to many regions, and it was quite a funny place to be in when there's a Queensland grape grower going down to Coonawarra and telling them what's the next varieties that they should have been looking at growing. So, it's just an incredible feeling to be part of such a sensational and world trusted organisation, the Winston Churchill Trust. And there's many people I have to thank, but I think I just thank everybody, all my referees, the people I met overseas and the people who've helped me on my return. So, you know, all I can say is never give up in this thing called life, because I certainly haven't. I've chased my dreams, and it's way above all the dreams that I imagined. And the Churchill Trust, the fellowship, is what opened that first door. So I'll hand it over to questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Mike. All right, well, look, we've only got the one question, so I think that we've covered off many of the questions perhaps in advance. So someone's asking, can your project referee be a professional living and working overseas where the project will be mainly based? Well, look, I think that can be okay. We do prefer referees to be here in Australia and Australian citizens. However, I think if the expertise lies in the person overseas and that gives credibility and weight to your application, then I would say, yeah, put in the best person you can recommend as a referee. So that's it. That's the shortest Q&A we've had so far. So there's a couple of minutes left. If anyone did have any questions that they'd like to ask, please feel free. Otherwise, I think I'm going to say thank you so much to Sally and to Mike for sharing your insights, and I really appreciate your time. It's one great thing about Churchill Fellows is they're always willing to give back, and really appreciate that very much. Thank you so much. All right.